The Serengeti has seen many predators in its endless history, but something felt different about this one. Rangers noticed him first, limping through the golden grass at dawn, his mane matted and torn. Other lions looked away when he passed, the pride scattered. Even the hyenas, those bold scavengers who normally circled anything weak, gave him space, but not out of respect, out of something darker, something that looked a lot like fear mixed with pity. His name was Kali, and the entire savannah had already written him off as done, a broken king walking through the dust of his own forgotten empire. It happened 3 months earlier. Kali had ruled a massive territory stretching across nearly 200 square kilometers, rich grasslands, permanent water sources, herds of zebra and wildebeest that moved through like clockwork, everything a lion could want. He had been young then, dominant, untouchable. His roar carried for miles, a sound that made every animal in earshot remember exactly where it stood in the food chain. The pride females looked to him for security. The younger males knew better than to even think about challenging him. Life was exactly what he had fought for. Then came the day that changed everything. 4 males appeared at the northern border. They moved like ghosts, coordinated and silent. No roaring warnings, no territorial displays, just pure tactical precision. Kali met them at the river, because that's what kings do. They meet challenges. He didn't imagine it would be his last stand as ruler. The fight was brief, maybe because he went in overconfident. Maybe because they had trained for months just for this moment. Maybe because sometimes the best warriors get unlucky. Kali took a deep wound across his back leg, a slash that cut all the way through muscle and tendon. The pain was unbearable, but worse than the pain was what came next. He lost control of that leg. The strength drained out of it like water through a cracked vessel. He couldn't run. He could barely walk. The 4 males pressed their advantage hard. When Kali finally managed to limp away into the tall grass, he left behind something more valuable than his territory. He left behind respect. The new kings took everything: the hunting grounds, the water holes, the lionesses. Within days they had marked every tree and rock with their scent. They roared from the same high points where Kali used to call out to his kingdom. Within weeks they were breeding with the females, ensuring their genetics would spread through the next generation. Kali's reign was over. More than that, it was erased, like it never happened at all. He tried at first to stay close, to reclaim what was his, but every time he approached the territory, the new kings drove him back, and every time they did, the limp got worse. His wound had started to get infected. The infection meant fever. Fever meant delirium. Delirium meant vulnerability. Other predators noticed. A pack of hyenas nearly took him down at a watering hole. He barely escaped by scrambling up an embankment that his injured leg could barely handle. A crocodile got his shoulder. Leopards tested him. Even jackals knew they had a shot. The world had flipped. The predator had become prey. Rangers who had been following him for years began to shake their heads. Some made bets on how long he had left. A week maybe. 2 weeks at most. You don't see a lion that broken actually recover. It goes against nature. The wounded die. That's how the savannah works. That's how it's always worked. But Kali didn't have the decency to die on schedule. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The limp was still there, worse than ever. His left back leg hung useless most of the time. He had to adapt the way he hunted. Instead of the explosive power that used to make his kills look easy, he became something else. Patient, calculating, strategic. He started hunting alone instead of the way most males do, resting and waiting for females to make the kill. Kali couldn't do that anymore. He had to be the hunter, the killer, the one who figured out every angle. A wounded antelope became his best friend. A old buffalo that couldn't keep up with the herd became his meal. He wasn't hunting the biggest or the strongest anymore. He was hunting the vulnerable, the slow, the sick, the ones nobody else wanted. The irony wasn't lost on the other predators. The great Kali, the roaring king, the male who used to dominate everything he touched, now picked scraps like a hyena. They laughed at him. The hyena clans would circle him, testing, poking, trying to see if this broken thing was still worth fearing. Every time they did, something happened that they didn't expect. Kali would move, not with the grace of before, but with a violence that was somehow worse, more desperate, more willing to fight to the absolute end. He killed 3 hyenas one night, while defending a half-eaten zebra. They were laughing, cackling that horrible laugh, and then suddenly 2 of them weren't laughing anymore because they weren't breathing. The other predators started to understand something that the rangers had missed. A broken lion is not the same thing as a weak lion. Weakness is a state of being. Brokenness is a choice. Kali had chosen to keep going, even though everything made sense to stop. Even though his legs screamed with pain every time he moved. Even though the territory that had been his was now ruled by others. Even though he was limping through the dust like a ghost of something that used to matter. The females of his old pride started to notice too. They had been forced into breeding with the new kings. It was nature's way after a takeover. But something about watching Kali survive, watching him hunt, watching him move through the territory, even though he had no right to be there anymore, changed something in how they saw him. He wasn't the dominant male anymore. He wasn't the provider. He wasn't the one making the decisions, but he was still fighting. He was still there. He was still refusing to disappear. Months passed, and the savannah began to shift in ways nobody could predict. The new kings had made mistakes that Kali's careful rule had never allowed. They were aggressive with the prey animals, killing more than they needed, wasting meat. The herds started moving away, finding territories with better odds. The hunting became harder. The new kings expected everything to be easy, expected the land to provide forever the way it had when Kali was still here. But the land doesn't work that way. The land punishes arrogance. The land rewards the ones who respect it. Kali, meanwhile, was learning things. His handicap forced him to hunt differently, and hunting differently meant he started finding prey that the stronger males missed. He learned to hunt at night when his lack of speed was less of a disadvantage. He learned to use the terrain, the rocks, the waterholes, the narrow passages between trees. He turned his disability into something that looked almost like an advantage. His bad leg became his signature. Every predator in the savannah knew it. When they saw an animal moving wrong, struggling, limping through the dust, they knew it was him. But they also knew something else by now. That broken leg wasn't making him weaker. It was making him something harder to kill. The rangers were starting to talk about him differently too. Less pity, more respect. One of them, an old man named Joseph who had been watching the savannah for 30 years, told tourists something that made them think. He said, "Watch the lion with the broken leg. That's where the real story is. Not the kings, not the ones with the perfect manes and the strength. The broken one, the one everybody counted out. That's the one you want to watch, because he's teaching us something about survival we're not supposed to know." Nobody had any idea what was about to happen. Nobody could have predicted it. Not the rangers, not the new kings, not even Kali himself probably. The savannah had its own story to tell, and it was just getting started. 6 months into his broken exile, Kali had become something that the savannah wasn't used to seeing. Not a king, not even a normal male, but something in between. Something that didn't fit into the categories everyone expected. He moved through territories that weren't his, hunted in places where only desperate animals went, and survived on prey that most lions would have ignored as not worth the effort. But every single day, he got better at it. Every single day, his body adapted. The infection in his leg finally cleared up around month 4. The scar tissue hardened. The muscles around the injury grew stronger in different ways, compensating, adjusting, becoming something new. The new kings didn't know any of this. They were too busy with their own problems. The territory that had seemed so perfect when they took it was becoming harder to maintain. The zebra herds that used to come through the eastern plains had changed their migration routes. The wildebeest that should have shown up during the dry season were going somewhere else, somewhere that felt safer to them. A wounded zebra might have eaten too much grass and gotten weak, but a smart zebra learns to avoid the place where lions killed its family. And these herds were learning. The hunting had become a genuine struggle for the first time in their reign. The leader of the new kings was a massive male named Bakari. He had a scar across his left eye that made him look mean, even when he was just resting. The other 3 males looked to him for decisions, and Bakari's decisions were getting worse. He was pushing too hard, hunting too aggressively, moving the pride constantly, never giving the females time to raise cubs properly, never settling anywhere long enough for the territory to feel secure. He was a conqueror, not a protector, and the difference between those two things is everything in the wild. The first real sign of trouble came when one of the females lost her entire litter. 3 cubs, dead within a week of being born. Bakari blamed her, said she wasn't strong enough, said her bloodline was weak. He forced her into breeding again almost immediately, which meant she had no time to recover, no time to heal properly. She was already struggling with her injuries from the takeover fight. Now she was struggling with trauma and starvation and the weight of Bakari's cruelty. She started to fade. You could see it in her movement, see it in her eyes. This was a female who had survived under Kali's protection. She remembered what a real male looked like. Another female managed to keep her cubs alive through sheer determination, but Bakari kept moving the pride before they were old enough to truly hunt. Cubs need stability. They need time to learn. They need mothers who aren't constantly terrified and constantly hungry. By the time those cubs were old enough to fend for themselves, one had already died from an infection. Another had been taken by a crocodile at a river crossing that Bakari insisted on making, even though it was clearly dangerous. The third survived but was so weak it could barely stand. The males were starting to fight each other too. That was new. Under Kali's rule, the prides had cohesion. Bakari kept the three other males in line through fear, through domination, through the constant threat of violence. But fear is an exhausting way to run a kingdom. Eventually, someone challenges it. One of the younger males, a lion named Simba, who had actually been born in this territory under Kali, started to push back against Bakari's authority. Nothing huge at first, just small challenges, hunting differently than Bakari wanted, marking territory in places Bakari hadn't approved, testing boundaries. Bakari's response was to beat him down hard, a serious fight that left Simba with a torn ear and a broken rib, and a new understanding of the cost of defiance. But something shifted in that fight. Simba didn't back down all the way. He submitted, yes, because that's what you do when you're outmatched. But there was something in his eyes when he did it. Something that said this wasn't over. Something that said he was waiting for a moment when the odds might be different. The rangers noticed the changes happening in the territory. Joseph marked them down carefully in his notebooks. Pride cohesion declining, hunting success rate dropping, female stress levels increasing, cub mortality rates spiking. The new kings were failing, not dramatically, not obviously, but failing nonetheless. And in the savannah, failure is a communicative thing. Other predators smell it, other males sense it, other prides know. Word travels on the wind and through the roars that carry for miles, and through the scent markings that tell stories to anyone paying attention. Hyena clans that had learned to fear Bakari started testing the borders again. A pack of wild dogs that had been pushed far away started moving back into hunting grounds they used to own. Even leopards, solitary creatures that normally avoid any kind of confrontation with lions, started to be seen more frequently near the waterholes. The entire ecosystem was responding to the fact that something had changed. The kings were still ruling, but they were ruling in the way that dictators rule, through fear and force and cruelty, and those kinds of kingdoms are always fragile. It was during this time that something remarkable happened. Kali crossed paths with one of his old females at a watering hole. Her name was Amara, and she had been his favorite, the one he had chosen to breed with twice, the one who had given him the strongest cubs. She was drinking alone, which was unusual. Normally the females moved in groups, especially under Bakari's rule, because together they were less likely to be targets of his unpredictable violence. Kali didn't approach her directly. He knew better. He was nothing to her now, or at least he was supposed to be nothing. But something about seeing her there, seeing the way her ribs showed through her fur, seeing the scar on her shoulder that definitely hadn't been there before, made something shift in him. He watched her from a distance. He watched her drink quickly and nervously, always looking over her shoulder. He watched her limp back toward the pride's resting area with the same kind of limp that he had, born from injury and pain rather than anything else. Amara knew he was watching. She would have known his scent anywhere. In the moment they locked eyes across the water, something passed between them. Not words, because lions don't have words for these things, but something wordless and true, a memory of what used to be, an acknowledgement of what had happened, a kind of sad recognition that sometimes the world takes what matters away from you. She didn't tell Bakari she had seen him. She had learned by now that information was dangerous in a pride run by fear, but she started to think differently about things. She started to remember what it had felt like to be protected rather than threatened. She started to wonder if there was a different way things could go, and more importantly, she started talking to the other females about what she had seen, not directly, not in a way that would get back to Bakari, but in the quiet conversations that females have when the males are sleeping, in the way they groomed each other and shared meat and supported each other through births and losses. Word spread. Kali was alive. Kali was surviving. Kali was still out there. Not as a threat to Bakari, because he was injured and exiled, and clearly not going to be taking back a territory anytime soon, but as a symbol, as a reminder that the world wasn't just this, wasn't just Bakari, and fear and starvation and cruelty. There had been something else before. There could be something else again. The young male Simba heard the stories too. In the way that Bakari didn't, he understood what those stories meant. They meant that the females were losing faith. They meant that the other males were starting to think about what came after Bakari. They meant that the foundation of the kingdom was cracking, not all at once like a dramatic collapse, but slowly, like a wall that's been taking rain for too long. And they meant something else too. They meant that there might be another choice. Simba started hunting alone. When Bakari called him to come participate in group hunts, Simba made excuses. His leg was sore. He had already eaten. He needed to patrol the eastern borders. He was always polite about it, always submissive in his body language, but he was also always absent. And when he was absent, he was learning about the territory in ways that Bakari never bothered to teach him, learning where the prey moved during different seasons, learning where the water sources were most reliable, learning about the weaknesses in the land that a good ruler could exploit and a bad ruler could ignore. Bakari didn't seem to care. Maybe he thought Simba's independence wasn't worth fighting about anymore. Maybe he was too focused on his own problems. Maybe he was just getting arrogant about his position, the way conquerors sometimes do. They take control of a kingdom and they assume it will be theirs forever, and they forget that they had to fight for it in the first place. They forget that kingdoms change hands all the time in the wild. They forget that the only thing keeping them on the throne is the willingness to keep fighting for it. One day, near the end of the dry season, 3 weeks after Simba had started hunting alone, something happened that nobody was expecting. A massive herd of buffalo moved through the territory, not the usual scattered groups. A real herd, hundreds of them. The kind of sight that makes every predator's heart start racing, because a herd that size means months of food if you can take advantage of it. Bakari mobilized immediately. He called all the males and females together. He made a plan that was actually pretty good. Bakari was a lot of things, but he wasn't stupid. He understood how to hunt when there was an opportunity this big. The hunt was set to happen at dawn. The plan was to drive a small group of buffalo away from the herd and isolate them at the river. The river had steep banks. The buffalo wouldn't be able to escape easily. It should have been perfect, but Simba didn't show up. When Bakari roared for him to take his position, Simba didn't come. When the hunt started and Bakari looked around expecting to see him moving in from the east like he was supposed to, there was nothing but empty grassland. Bakari was furious. The hunt went forward anyway, but without Simba, the formation was wrong. The buffalo escaped more easily than they should have. The kill that should have been simple turned into a chaotic chase that ended with only a young calf being brought down. A young calf, not even close to worth the energy the hunt took. Bakari was beside himself with rage. He roared accusations. He demanded to know where Simba was. He swore he was going to find him and make him understand the cost of defiance. He worked himself into such a state that he wasn't thinking clearly. He wasn't thinking about where Simba might be or why he might not have shown up. He was just thinking about punishment and power and control. When Simba finally appeared that evening, walking slowly out of the tall grass on the eastern side of the territory, Bakari launched himself at him with absolutely no strategy. Just pure rage. Just the need to dominate and hurt and make Simba understand that you don't defy the king. It should have been a quick fight. Bakari was bigger. Bakari was stronger. Bakari had beaten Simba before and had the scars to prove it. But that was before Simba had spent the entire dry season learning the territory, before he had figured out exactly where to position himself for maximum advantage, before he had watched Kali hunt and noticed the way a smart male uses terrain instead of just raw power. Simba fought differently than Bakari expected. He fought with intelligence. He moved to where the light was wrong for Bakari to see properly. He used a small ravine to get lower, to come up underneath Bakari's guard. He fought like he had been planning this moment since the day Bakari broke his rib. The other males watched. The females watched. Everyone watched as the young male who was supposed to be nothing suddenly became dangerous. Bakari was still stronger, but strength doesn't always win. Not when someone younger is moving faster. Not when someone desperate has been learning while the strong one has been resting. Simba took a deep bite to his shoulder but gave one right back to Bakari's throat. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to send a message. Bakari retreated, breathing hard, bleeding, shocked that anything like this could happen. And in that moment of shock, Simba did something that would change everything about how the territory worked. He roared, not a challenge roar, not a territorial roar, a different kind of roar entirely. The kind of roar that says I'm still standing, the kind that says I'm not done, the kind that says to every predator, every female, every rival within miles, that something has shifted, something fundamental has changed. The king is wounded, the throne is not as solid as it seemed, and across the territory, in his exile territory, limping through the dust on 3 good legs and one that would never be quite right again, Kali heard that roar. He stopped moving. He lifted his head, and for the first time in 6 months, something that looked a lot like hope moved through his chest. The roar traveled for miles. It was the kind of sound that makes other animals stop what they're doing and listen. The kind of roar that carries meaning beyond just noise. In the watering holes, prey animals lifted their heads and decided to drink somewhere else. In the trees, birds scattered. Even the hyena clans paused their evening hunts and turned toward the sound, understanding that something was happening in the lion territory that mattered. Kali knew exactly what that roar meant. A young male was challenging the king. Whether he would win or lose, that didn't matter right now. What mattered was that the foundation had cracked. What mattered was that Bakari was no longer as untouchable as he had seemed 6 months ago when he had driven Kali out into exile. Kali had spent the entire time since his injury thinking about death, thinking about how long he had left, thinking about the unfairness of how quickly power could disappear. But in that moment, hearing Simba's roar, something shifted in his mind. Something dangerous woke up. He couldn't take back his territory directly. His leg wouldn't allow it. He wasn't strong enough to fight a 3-on-1 battle the way he used to be. But there were other ways. There were always other ways if you were desperate enough to think about them. If you were willing to do things that lions didn't normally do. If you were willing to break the rules of how things were supposed to work. The next morning, Kali did something that shocked every predator watching the territory. He walked toward the pride, not toward the edges like he had been doing, straight toward the center, toward the resting areas, toward Bakari himself. He moved slowly because his leg wouldn't allow anything else, but he moved with a purpose that was unmistakable. He was coming back, not to take over, not to fight a battle he couldn't win, but to do something else entirely. The females saw him first. They were lying in the shade with their cubs when they caught his scent on the wind. The reaction was immediate, not fear, not the kind of defensive aggression that Bakari's presence would have caused. Recognition, something like relief. Amara lifted her head and watched him approach. She didn't call out, she didn't try to stop him, but her eyes tracked his movement, and when he passed near her, she inclined her head slightly. Just a small gesture, but a gesture that meant something, that meant she understood what he was doing. Bakari heard the commotion from across the territory. He came running, still wounded from his fight with Simba, still furious, still convinced that he could handle anything that came at him. What he found was Kali standing in the middle of the resting area, not looking aggressive, not looking like he wanted to fight, just standing there, looking at him. The broken leg was obvious, the limp was obvious. To anyone looking, Kali looked like exactly what he was, damaged, exiled, desperate. But Bakari wasn't thinking straight anymore. The wound on his throat was bothering him. The loss of control was terrifying him. He saw Kali standing there, and all he could think was that this was another challenge, another threat to his power, another male trying to take what was his. He attacked without thinking, and that was his mistake. What Bakari didn't understand was that Kali wasn't there to fight him. Kali was there to do something different. As Bakari charged, Kali moved sideways instead of forward. He used his broken leg intentionally, letting it look like he was stumbling, letting Bakari think he had the advantage. Bakari overcommitted to the attack, leaning too hard into it, and Kali was ready. He grabbed Bakari's mane and pulled him off balance, making him crash into a large rock that was nearby. It wasn't a killing blow, it was a humiliation blow. The kind of move that said to everyone watching that Bakari wasn't in control anymore, that Bakari could be moved around, that Bakari was vulnerable. Kali didn't press the advantage. He didn't go for a killing bite. He just released Bakari and limped backward, leaving the king stunned and bleeding and confused about what had just happened. That was when Simba arrived. He had been hunting at the edges of the territory when he heard the commotion. He came running, and what he found was Bakari on the ground and Kali standing over him. For a moment, Simba seemed confused. He looked at Kali like he was trying to understand what side the old king was on. What Kali did next made it clear. Kali looked directly at Simba and then looked at Bakari. Then he limped away, slowly, deliberately, leaving the field clear, leaving the message unmistakable. Go ahead, he was saying. This is your moment. I've already had my time as king. Now it's your turn, but do it right. Do it better than he did. Simba understood. He moved toward Bakari slowly, giving the king a chance to stand up, giving him a chance to fight properly, because that's what the code demanded, a real fight, a real challenge, not an execution. Bakari got to his feet, and what happened next was a battle that the rangers who were watching would talk about for the rest of their lives. It was brutal, it was quick, it was decisive. Simba was younger, faster, less injured. Bakari was bigger, meaner, more experienced. They slammed into each other with the kind of force that made the ground shake. Claws tore through manes, teeth found purchase in shoulders and throats. Both of them bled, both of them screamed, but Simba had something Bakari had lost. Simba had hope. Simba had been trained by watching a broken lion survive. Simba had learned that sometimes victory comes not from being the strongest, but from being smart enough and desperate enough and willing enough to fight even when the odds seem impossible. The fight lasted maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. It felt longer because so much was happening so fast. When it ended, Bakari was on his back, breathing hard, unable to get up. Simba stood over him, and for a moment, it seemed like he might finish it, might kill the king completely and make sure he never came back. The females held their breath. The other males watched to see what kind of ruler Simba was going to be. Simba didn't kill him. He roared instead. A long, powerful roar that echoed across the entire territory, and Bakari, understanding that he had lost everything, crawled away into the tall grass. He would live, probably. He would wander the savannah the way exiled males do. He would eventually try to take over some smaller, weaker pride. Maybe he would succeed. Maybe he would die trying. But he would never rule this territory again. He would never be king here. The other 2 males who had come with Bakari watched what happened and made a quick calculation. They could fight Simba and probably lose. They could try to support Bakari and probably die. Or they could accept that the regime had changed and try to find a place in the new order. 2 of them chose the third option. They came forward and showed their submission to Simba, not the cringing, fearful submission they had shown to Bakari. The honest submission of males who recognized strength and respected it. One of them, though, did something different. He looked at Kali. He looked at the broken male standing on 3 good legs and one that wouldn't work right anymore, and he approached him. Kali tensed, ready for a fight, even though he knew he probably couldn't win one right now. But the male didn't attack. He dropped his head slightly and moved past Kali with a small gesture that might have been respect, might have been acknowledgement, might have been a predator recognizing a predator who had done something extraordinary. The females came forward next, slowly at first, cautiously, making sure this new thing was real. But coming forward, they approached Simba and showed their acceptance. He had fought hard, he had won, he had the right to rule, and unlike Bakari, Simba seemed to understand something important. He looked at the females and then looked at Kali, and something passed between them, an understanding, a promise, a different way of doing things. What happened over the next few weeks would be documented in the rangers' notebooks and talked about for years in wildlife circles. Kali didn't leave. He stayed in the territory, and Simba didn't force him out. Instead, something new began to develop, a partnership, not a formal thing, not something with rules written down, but something real nonetheless. Simba was a great fighter, but he was still young and still learning how to be a king. Kali had been a great king, but now he was broken and couldn't do the physical things a king needed to do. Together, though, they made something that worked. Kali would advise on hunting strategy. Simba would execute the hunts. Kali would suggest how to approach territorial disputes. Simba would handle the actual confrontations. Kali would help the females understand what they needed. Simba would provide it. The territory began to change under their shared rule. The females noticed it first. The stress levels that had been so high under Bakari began to drop. The food was more steady. The pride was more stable. Cubs started surviving at higher rates. The other predators noticed it too. The hyena clans that had been testing the borders found themselves pushed back firmly, but not cruelly. Leopards that had been venturing into lion territory suddenly remembered why they shouldn't. Even the crocodiles at the river seemed to understand that this was a place where they needed to be careful. Word spread through the savannah the way these things do. The broken king and the young king together, an unusual arrangement, something that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Hunters started calling Kali the Ghost King because he was there but not there, powerful but not visible, ruling from the shadows while Simba handled the spotlight. But the most remarkable thing happened with the other exiled males. Males who had been driven out by the previous kings. Males who had been wandering the savannah alone, struggling to survive, losing hope. They started coming back to the territory, not to challenge, but to ask for help, to see if they could be part of something that actually worked. And Simba, learning from Kali's example, started accepting them, not as rivals to be destroyed, but as additions to the pride, males who could help hunt, males who could help defend, males who understood that you don't have to be a king to have value in a pride. The old way, the way Bakari had done it, was to control through fear, to make yourself the only strong one so that everyone depended on you, to crush any potential threat before it could grow. Kali and Simba were doing something different. They were building through strength, yes, but also through trust. They were creating a place where being weak didn't mean death, where being different didn't mean exile, where having a disability, like Kali's broken leg, didn't mean you had nothing to offer. 3 months after Simba took over, the Rangers were documenting something that they had never seen before. A pride that was growing, not just in females and cubs, but in males. Multiple males working together, multiple males hunting together, multiple males sharing the responsibility of protection. The territory was thriving. The prey populations were stable because the hunting was sustainable, not desperate. The females were healthy because the food was steady. The cubs were surviving because the pride was stable. Kali's leg never fully healed. He would limp for the rest of his life, but he had stopped thinking of it as a weakness. It had become his signature. When the females spoke of him to their cubs, they would point to his limp and tell them about survival, about how the savannah doesn't care if you're perfect. It only cares if you keep trying, about how sometimes the things that break us can teach us the most important lessons if we're willing to listen. One evening, about 4 months after Simba had taken over, Kali was resting near the waterhole when a young cub approached him. The cub was one of the ones that had been born under Bakari's rule, the ones that had barely survived. The cub approached carefully, the way young animals do when they're trying to understand something. It sniffed Kali's leg, the broken one, the damaged one, and then it licked it gently, the way cubs do when they want to show affection. Kali's eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened again, there was something in them that looked a lot like tears. But lions don't cry, so maybe it was just the evening light playing tricks. Maybe it was just the reflection in his eyes from the water. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the understanding that sometimes breaking is just another way of becoming something stronger. The rangers watched it all unfold and wrote careful notes. Joseph, the old ranger who had been following this territory for 30 years, made an entry in his journal that night. He wrote about how they had thought Kali was finished 6 months ago, how they had written him off as damaged and useless and destined for death, how they had been wrong about all of it. He wrote, "The savannah teaches us that strength comes in many forms. We thought it came from the ability to fight, from the size of your mane, from the volume of your roar, but this territory is teaching us something different. It's teaching us that strength also comes from refusing to quit, when quitting would be easier, from adapting to what life gives you, instead of crying about what it took away, from finding a way to be useful, even when you can't be what you used to be." The broken king didn't take back his throne, but he didn't need to. He had discovered something more valuable. He had discovered that there are more ways to matter than through domination, more ways to be a king than through fear, more ways to change a world than through the volume of your roar. A year passed, then 2 years, then 5. The savannah has a way of forgetting quickly, moving on to the next drama, the next king, the next story. But this territory didn't forget, couldn't forget, because what was happening here was becoming something that predators across the entire region were starting to understand, something that was changing how the whole game worked. Kali was 11 years old now. 11 is ancient for a wild lion. Most males don't make it past 10. The fact that he was still alive was remarkable. The fact that he was still relevant was even more remarkable. His leg had deteriorated further over the years. He barely used it anymore. When he walked, his body had adapted so completely to the limp that watching him move was like watching a entirely different kind of creature. not graceful the way lions are supposed to be, but efficient in a way that only came from years of learning to work with what you had instead of mourning what you lost. Simba was in his prime now, strong, confident, experienced enough to make good decisions, but young enough to execute them with power. He and Kali had developed a partnership that the rangers said was unlike anything they had ever documented. They hunted together sometimes, though it was always a modified hunt because of Kali's leg. Kali would position himself somewhere strategic, somewhere that used the terrain in a clever way. He wouldn't participate in the actual chase, but he would be ready to cut off escape routes or to block a charging buffalo from going in the direction it wanted to go. His disability had become a tool. The pride had grown. There were now 3 other males who had chosen to stay, who had become part of the structure that Kali and Simba had built. They weren't slaves to Simba's authority the way the other males had been to Bakari's. They were partners. They understood that if one of them fell, the others would back them up. If one of them got injured, the others would provide for them. It was revolutionary. It shouldn't have worked. Pride males don't usually cooperate like this. They compete, they fight, they jockey for dominance. But here, something different was happening. Something was teaching them that cooperation was actually stronger than competition. That a male who helped his brothers was a male who had brothers to help him when he needed it. That the territory was stronger when everyone was invested in its success rather than just trying to be the one on top. The females had noticed it too. They had started to change how they interacted with the males. With Bakari, they had been cautious, always worried about his mood, always careful not to trigger his anger. With Simba and Kali, they were different. They would push back sometimes when they disagreed. They would suggest hunting strategies. They would move the cubs to different areas if they thought a location was too dangerous. They had started to have a voice in how the pride functioned. One of the females, a strong hunter named Zara, had become something like a second-in-command to the lionesses. She coordinated hunts. She made decisions about where cubs should be kept during dangerous times. She mediated disputes between females, and neither Simba nor Kali ever overruled her unless the safety of the entire pride was at stake. It was a small thing, but it changed how the whole pride operated. The cubs born under this new system were different too. They grew up watching males cooperate instead of compete. They grew up seeing disability as something you adapted to rather than something that made you worthless. They grew up understanding that a good leader wasn't necessarily the one who roared the loudest or fought the hardest, but the one who thought about what was best for everyone. One of Kali's own cubs, a female born to Amara about 2 years into the new regime, was showing remarkable intelligence. The rangers called her Thandi, and she was studying the prey animals and the terrain with an intensity that suggested she might become a legendary hunter. But what was most interesting about Thandi was how she treated males. She didn't defer to them automatically. She didn't assume they knew better. She asked questions. She challenged assumptions. And the males around her, including her own father Kali, seemed to respect that rather than seeing it as a threat. The hunting patterns in the territory had evolved in ways that the rangers were actively studying. Under Bakari, the kills had been aggressive and wasteful. Too much meat killed, too much left to rot. Under Kali and Simba, the hunting had become more strategic. They would target specific animals. They would take what they needed and leave the rest of the carcass for the other predators. The hyena clans actually had more food under the new system because there was more scavenger opportunity. Even the relationship with the hyenas had changed. There was a particular clan led by a massive female named Kaida, who had actually started to have what looked like an understanding with the lions. It wasn't friendship exactly. Predators don't have friends, but it was a kind of mutual respect. The hyenas wouldn't challenge the lions over kills. The lions wouldn't actively hunt hyenas the way Bakari used to. They would tolerate each other's presence in a way that benefited both species. The other prides in the region had started to notice what was happening. A young female lion from a neighboring pride had actually approached Simba one day, not to challenge him but to ask if she could join the pride. She had been driven out by her own family because she was deaf in one ear. Nobody wanted a handicapped lioness, but Simba had accepted her, and she had become one of the best hunters in the pride because she used her other senses in ways that other lionesses didn't. Word was spreading, not through scientific journals or ranger reports, but through the network that predators understand, through roars and scent markings, and the subtle ways that information travels in the wild. A territory where being different didn't mean death, a territory where injury wasn't the end of your value. a territory where cooperation worked better than fear. Other exiled animals started making their way here. Some were accepted, some were turned away because the pride already had what it needed. But the fact that they came said something important about what word had gotten out. The rangers had started to receive visitors, researchers from universities, behavioral scientists, biologists who wanted to study what was happening here. Joseph, the old ranger, had become something of a celebrity because he had been watching Kali's entire journey. He wrote papers, he gave lectures, he told the story of the broken lion to anyone who would listen. Some scientists were skeptical. They said that lions couldn't operate this way, that pride dynamics required domination and fear, that cooperation on this level was theoretically impossible, that something else must be going on. But the evidence was there. The rangers had hours of footage, they had hunting patterns, they had cub survival rates, they had behavioral documentation that showed something genuinely different happening. One particularly famous wildlife researcher spent 3 months following this pride. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chen, and she was studying animal consciousness and decision-making. What she observed in Kali and Simba's territory changed how she understood predator psychology. She documented Kali making deliberate choices, teaching younger males through example, showing patience with females who were learning new hunting techniques, making decisions that benefited the collective rather than just himself. In her research paper, Dr. Chen wrote something that would become quoted in wildlife circles for years to come. She wrote, "We have long assumed that predator behavior is driven primarily by instinct and hierarchical dominance. What we are witnessing in this territory suggests that might be incomplete. These lions are demonstrating behavior that suggests conscious decision-making, long-term planning, and an apparent understanding of social responsibility. The broken king, Kali, appears to have deliberately chosen to use his disability and his exile, not as a reason to give up, but as an opportunity to reimagine what leadership could be. This is not instinctive behavior. This is evolved behavior. This is animals making choices about how to structure their society." The paper sparked debates in academic circles. Some researchers said it was anthropomorphism, that she was reading human motivations into animal behavior, that she was letting emotion cloud her scientific judgment. But other researchers started to look more carefully at predator behavior in general, and they started to notice things they had missed before. Animals making decisions, animals learning from each other, animals sometimes choosing cooperation when competition would have been easier. By the time Kali was 14, he was barely hunting anymore. He spent most of his time resting, teaching younger males through proximity and example rather than through active participation. His body was breaking down in the way that old bodies do. The leg that had never healed properly was causing him increasing pain. His teeth were wearing down. His hearing was getting worse. But something remarkable happened. The pride didn't start treating him differently as he got weaker. They didn't start looking to replace him. They didn't start jockeying for position after he died, because they didn't see his death as something to celebrate or take advantage of. They saw it as a loss, a real, genuine loss of something important. The females brought him the best meat from every kill. Young males would come sit near him and listen to him breathe, learning just by being in his presence. Cubs would approach him without fear because they had been taught that this broken old lion was not something to pity or avoid. He was something to respect. Amara, Kali's mate, spent more and more time with him as he got older. In the last year of his life, she rarely left his side. She would rest her head on his chest, listening to his heart. The rangers watching this would sometimes have to look away because it was too much, too real, too human in a way that made it hard to remember they were just watching animals. When Kali finally died, it was quietly, it was at dawn, in the spot where he had first emerged from exile. His body simply stopped working, his breathing slowed, then stopped. Simba was there, Amara was there, several of the younger males were there. They stood around him for hours, not moving, just being present for the body of the lion who had changed everything. The rangers documented it carefully. Joseph sat in his vehicle and cried, actually cried. He had been watching animals for 30 years, and he had never cried over one before, but this was different. This was a story that had a meaning beyond just what happened in the wild. This was a story about second chances, about not giving up, about choosing to see your broken parts as gifts instead of curses. The funeral, if you could call it that, was something the rangers had never seen before. The pride gathered around Kali's body and they roared. Not aggressive roars, not territorial roars, mourning roars. the kind of sounds that carried the weight of loss. Other prides in the region heard those roars, and something seemed to understand that something important had happened. Simba took over fully after Kali died. He was older now, wiser, and he carried forward everything that Kali had taught him. The pride didn't collapse. It didn't splinter. It actually grew stronger because the system they had built together was strong enough to survive the loss of its founder. Over the next few years, Simba had his own cubs, several males. They grew up under a father who had learned from a legend. They grew up in a pride that valued cooperation and learning over pure aggression. Some of them would eventually leave to start their own prides, and in those prides, they would carry forward the lessons their father had learned from Kali. The Broken King's legacy would spread through the region like ripples from a stone thrown in water. Thandai, Kali's daughter, became the greatest hunter her territory had ever seen. But more importantly, she became a teacher. She showed younger females that hunting wasn't just about pure power. It was about strategy, patience, adaptation. She had learned by watching her father work with his disability. She had learned that limitations could become advantages if you understood how to use them. 5 years after Kali died, a young lion from a neighboring territory was badly injured. A buffalo horn had crushed his front left leg beyond repair. The leg hung useless from his body. By all rights, he should have been exiled, should have been left to die. But he had heard the story of the Broken King, the story of Kali. So instead of giving up, instead of wandering into the wilderness, he came to Simba's territory. Simba accepted him, taught him, showed him how a lion with a broken leg could still hunt, could still matter, could still be valuable. And that young lion went on to become a respected member of the pride, eventually fathering cubs of his own. He became known as the Second Broken King, a name that didn't sound like shame anymore. It sounded like honor. The Rangers documented it all. Joseph wrote a final paper before he retired. In it, he talked about the unexpected lessons the Savannah had taught him. He wrote about how sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones who have suffered the most, how sometimes the most powerful leaders are the ones who understand what it means to be powerless, how sometimes an animal's greatest strength comes not from being born strong, but from choosing to stay strong even after the world has broken them. His conclusion was simple. We came to this territory expecting to see lions. We expected to see predators, hunger, dominance, and death. We expected to see the rules of nature as we understood them. What we actually saw was something more complex. We saw animals making choices, choosing compassion over cruelty, choosing cooperation over competition, choosing to build something together rather than tear each other down. If lions can figure this out, maybe there's hope for the rest of us too. Decades would pass. Kali's bloodline would spread through the entire region. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren would establish territories following the model he and Simba had created. The landscape would be different because of one lion who refused to accept that his broken leg meant the end of his story, because he chose to see his limitation as an opportunity. The Savannah would remember him, not as the king who fell, but as the king who got back up, different than before, broken in ways that never fully healed, but stronger for having survived, more valuable for having learned, more important for having chosen to use what remained of his power not to dominate, but to build something that would outlast him. In the end, that's what it was all about. Not whether Kali could reclaim his throne. He never did. Simba was the king. But whether Kali could matter in a world that had decided he didn't deserve to, whether he could find value when the world had written him off as damaged goods, whether he could become a legend not because of his strength but because of his refusal to surrender to the weakness he had been handed. The Rangers would bring visitors to the territory and point out Kali's favorite resting spots. They would tell the story of the Broken King to tourists who came expecting to see the usual lion drama, and those tourists would go home and tell the story to other people. And eventually, it became more than just what happened in one territory. It became a parable, a teaching story, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be broken by your brokenness. In the end, Kali didn't have to roar louder than anyone else. He didn't have to be the biggest or the strongest. He just had to be the one willing to try harder, think differently, and refuse to accept the world's version of what his limitations meant. And that turned out to be enough, more than enough. It turned out to be the kind of thing that changes everything. The Broken King had come home, not to the throne he had lost, but to something bigger, something that would matter long after every lion in that territory was gone. He had proven that sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting back to where you started. Sometimes it's becoming something you never would have been if you hadn't broken in the first place. Sometimes the scariest thing is not the fall, it's the courage to stand back up and build something new from the ruins.